The photograph declassified in 2013 shows a crater in a North Carolina tobacco field, 25 feet wide, unmarked except for a small memorial plaque installed decades later. This is where a Mark 39 thermonuclear bomb hit the ground at 700 miles per hour on January 24, 1961. 4 megatons of explosive force, 260 times more powerful than Hiroshima, buried itself 50 feet deep in American farmland. The bomb had armed itself during the fall. 3 of its 4 safety mechanisms had failed. A single switch stood between a quiet January night and a thermonuclear detonation that would have killed everyone within 8 miles instantly and spread lethal fallout from Washington, D.C. to New York City. This is the story of the Goldsboro B-52 crash, how a routine Cold War patrol became the closest America ever came to accidentally nuking itself, and how a $50 mechanical failure nearly killed 3 million people. January 23, 1961, 18:30 hours. Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, North Carolina. Major Walter Scott Tulloch climbed into the B-52 Stratofortress for the 48th time and ran through pre-flight checks he could perform in his sleep. Oil pressure, fuel flow, engine temperatures, hydraulics, everything normal. The mission briefing had been standard. Operation Chrome Dome Patrol. 24 hours airborne carrying live nuclear weapons. 1 aerial refueling. Return tomorrow night. He'd flown this exact route 47 times before. The B-52G waiting on the tarmac was serial number 58-0187, 160 feet of strategic bomber, 8 engines, and in the internal weapons bay 2, Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs. Each weapon was 12 feet long, weighed 10,000 pounds, and contained 3.8 megatons of explosive force. It was January 1961. John Kennedy had been president for 4 days. The Cold War demanded that nuclear-armed bombers fly continuously over American territory. If Soviet missiles destroyed the air bases, aircraft already airborne would survive to retaliate. Chrome Dome missions flew every day, all day, carrying live thermonuclear weapons over American cities and farmland. The risk of accident seemed acceptable compared to vulnerability to Soviet first strike. Strategic Air Command had calculated the odds. Mechanical failures were rare, catastrophic failures rarer still, and the weapons had 6 independent safety mechanisms. A nuclear detonation by accident was impossible. The engineers were certain. At 19:30 hours, Tulloch advanced the throttles and the B-52 rolled down the runway. 180,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, and weapons accelerated to 180 miles per hour. The bomber lifted into the January night, navigation lights blinking against the darkness. Behind them, Goldsboro disappeared. Ahead, the patrol route stretched along the Atlantic coast. 7 other crew members were aboard. Lieutenant Adam Maddox, instructor pilot, Captain Charles Newnham, radar navigator, Sergeant Francis Barnish, tail gunner. In a few hours, 3 of them would be dead. The others would survive because of decisions made in seconds. Eject now, or wait 1 more moment. Pull this handle or that one. The first 4 hours were perfect. The B-52 climbed to 29,500 feet and settled into cruise. The engines found their rhythm. Inside the pressurized cabin, crew members rotated through their stations. Tulloch monitored instruments with automatic attention. Everything normal. This was the routine that made the entire operation seem safe. The same headings, same altitudes, same radio checkpoints. War that never came, practiced endlessly until it felt more real than reality. At 01:30 hours, they prepared for aerial refueling. A KC-135 Stratotanker was orbiting ahead. The B-52 couldn't complete its patrol without refueling. The mission demanded it. Tulloch had done this hundreds of times. Position behind the tanker, connect the boom, take on 6,000 gallons of fuel, disconnect, continue. 30 minutes, routine as breathing. The rendezvous went smoothly. The tanker's boom locked into the B-52's receptacle with a solid thunk. Fuel began flowing at 600 gallons per minute. At 01:53 hours, a warning light illuminated on Tulloch's panel. The B-52's fuel gauges were dropping, fast. This wasn't normal consumption. This was catastrophic loss. Somewhere in the fuel system something had failed completely. Tulloch disconnected from the tanker immediately. We've got a fuel leak. Running emergency checklist. The B-52 carried 46,575 gallons of JP-4 jet fuel. That fuel was now escaping into the slipstream faster than the gauges could measure. The crew ran emergency procedures, tried to isolate which tank was leaking, attempted to cross-feed from damaged systems to intact ones. Nothing worked. They were losing approximately 5,500 gallons and the rate wasn't decreasing. Tulloch made the decision instantly. Abort mission. Return to Seymour Johnson. Get on the ground before the fuel situation became unsurvivable. He banked toward home and began descending. The navigator calculated 18 minutes to base. Maybe. At 0200 hours, Tulloch radioed the tower. Buzz 1-4, declaring emergency. Catastrophic fuel leak, returning to base. Request priority landing. The response was calm, professional. Buzz 1-4, you're cleared for immediate approach. Fire and rescue rolling. On the ground, fire trucks moved into position. The control tower watched radars. The B-52 descended. Serious situation, but manageable. Aircraft had fuel leaks. Crews dealt with them. That's what training was for. But at 10,000 feet, a new warning appeared. Right-wing fuel pressure critical. The leak wasn't just bleeding fuel. It was affecting the aircraft's center of gravity. With thousands of gallons draining from the right wing, the aerodynamics were changing unpredictably. Tulloch felt it in the controls. The aircraft was heavy on the right side, wanting to bank right. He applied left aileron. The B-52 responded sluggishly. The control forces were wrong. At 8,000 feet, they were 12 miles from the runway. Tulloch could see the lights ahead. So close. Just maintain control for a few more minutes. The right wing dropped. Tulloch pulled the yoke left. Full deflection. The wing came back up slowly, fighting him. The B-52 was barely responding. Whatever was happening had progressed beyond a fuel leak. The wing structure was failing, or the center of gravity had shifted beyond controllable limits. The right wing dropped again, harder. The aircraft entered an uncommanded roll. The artificial horizon tilted past 30 degrees, past 45. The nose dropped, airspeed increasing, altitude decreasing. At 5,000 feet, the aircraft banked past 60 degrees. Warning lights illuminated across every panel. Fires, hydraulic failures, flight control failures. The systems were cascading. Tulloch pulled with everything he had. The B-52 wasn't responding. It was rolling inverted, and he couldn't stop it. At 2,000 feet, he reached for the bailout alarm. The command crackled through the intercom. Lieutenant Maddox grabbed his ejection handles. Captain Newnham reached for his. In the tail, Sergeant Barnish grabbed for the manual bailout hatch. The aircraft rolled past 90 degrees. Inverted. G-forces pinned crew members in their seats, made reaching ejection handles like pushing through concrete. Some managed to eject. The downward-firing seats blasted them through the fuselage with bone-breaking force. Others couldn't reach the controls. Others hesitated 1 second too long, waiting for control to return, waiting for something that wasn't coming. At 0224 hours, at 700 feet altitude over Wayne County, the B-52 broke apart. The right wing tore off first, then the fuselage fractured. The tail separated. The aircraft disintegrated into debris falling toward Earth. And in the weapons bay, 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs released from their shackles and began falling toward the darkness below. The bombs had extensive safety mechanisms, mechanical safing pins, electrical isolation switches, barometric sensors, timer mechanisms, 6 different systems, any one of which should prevent accidental detonation. The engineers had been thorough, but those systems were designed for controlled release. Bomb bay doors opening normally, electrical disconnection in proper sequence, separation under standard conditions, not for catastrophic aircraft disintegration, not for the violence of a bomber tearing itself apart at low altitude. As the bombs fell through the January night, tumbling through freezing air toward Carolina farmland, certain systems began to activate. Systems that couldn't distinguish between authorized deployment and uncontrolled ejection. Systems responding to airflow and acceleration and altitude change exactly as designed for normal weapons release. The bombs were arming themselves. 3 miles below, the town of Faro slept. Population 350. Families in their beds, children dreaming, people whose survival now depended on whether switches inside 2 falling bombs functioned exactly as designed or failed by the smallest margin. 5 crew members would survive, 3 would not. Those numbers would be recorded in accident reports and mourned by families. But the human casualties were nothing compared to what was falling in those bombs. One of them was tumbling end over end, and when it hit the ground, 3 of its 4 safety mechanisms would be in the armed position. 1 switch away from full thermonuclear detonation over American soil. Nobody on the ground had any idea it was coming. The engineers had been certain a nuclear weapon couldn't detonate accidentally. In approximately 30 seconds, they were going to be proven almost fatally wrong. Lieutenant Adam Maddox regained consciousness hanging upside down in his parachute harness, 20 feet above a North Carolina tobacco field. His left arm was broken. He could feel the bones grinding. Blood ran up his face from a gash on his forehead, pooling in his eyes because gravity was reversed. Above him, his parachute had snagged in pine trees. He didn't remember ejecting. His last clear memory was the B-52 rolling inverted and Tulloch's voice screaming, "Bail out!" Everything after was fragmentary. Explosive force, wind violence, the parachute opening hard enough to dislocate his shoulder. Maddox released his harness with his good hand and dropped 20 feet onto frozen ground. The impact sent white pain through his broken arm. He knelt there, breathing hard, trying to think through shock and injury. In the distance, maybe 2 miles away, orange light flickered against clouds. Something burning. The B-52. And then a thought colder than the January air. The weapons. 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs, 4 megatons each. The briefing said they were safe. 6 different safety mechanisms. Couldn't possibly detonate accidentally. That's what the engineers promised. The engineers had never considered what happened to those mechanisms when a bomber disintegrated at 700 feet. 3 miles away, Weapon 1 was falling through darkness under a fully deployed parachute. The bomb had separated from the weapons bay, and its internal systems began responding exactly as designed. The problem was simple and terrifying. The arming sequence couldn't distinguish between an authorized attack and catastrophic accident. Both looked identical to the switches and sensors inside the weapon. Electrical disconnection from aircraft. First safety mechanism interpreted this as normal weapons release. Activated, freefall detected, altitude decreasing rapidly. Second mechanism recognized authorized drop profile. Activated. The drogue parachute deployed automatically, stabilized the tumbling fall. Third mechanism activated. The main parachute opened with a crack audible over the wind. 24 feet of white canopy slowed the weapon to 30 feet per second. Fourth mechanism activated. Inside the weapon, electrical circuits that had been isolated were now connected and energized. Mechanical locks were released. The arming sequence was proceeding exactly as during an actual nuclear strike. High voltage thermal batteries received their activation signal, a voltage spike from the breakup matching authorized arming commands. Fifth mechanism activated. One safety remained. The arm/safe switch, a simple rotary mechanism physically disconnecting the firing circuit from detonators. It was in the safe position. At 02:24 hours, Weapon 1 hit a tobacco field 3 miles east of Faro. The parachute had slowed descent enough that impact didn't destroy the weapon. It buried itself 3 feet deep, casing cracked, but intact. 5 switches armed, 1 switch safe. If that final switch had jarred to arm position, the firing circuit would have energized. The detonators would have fired. Conventional explosives would have compressed the plutonium to critical mass. The fission reaction would have triggered fusion. 3.8 megatons would have vaporized everything within 8 miles instantly. The weapon lay buried, undetected, fully armed except for 3 ounces of metal in the correct position. Weapon 2 fell differently. It separated nose down and accelerated towards 700 miles per hour. The drogue chute deployed, but supersonic airflow tore it away. The main parachute never deployed. Without the parachute sequence, the arming mechanisms detected something wrong. The safety systems that failed in Weapon 1 remained inactive in Weapon 2. The weapon hit the ground like a meteor. 10,000 pounds at 700 miles per hour punched through topsoil, through clay, through the water table. The weapon crushed on impact, destroyed by sheer kinetic violence without detonating. It came to rest somewhere between 50 and 200 feet underground. Buried so deep recovery would be impossible. 45 seconds total, from aircraft breakup to both weapons on the ground. 45 seconds during which millions of lives depended on the position of switches inside falling bombs. At 02:45 hours, Calvin Horn saw a man in an Air Force flight suit walking along Highway 117. The man was cradling his arm and there was blood on his face. Horn stopped. "You okay?" Maddox looked at him with eyes that had seen something terrible. "I need a phone. There's been an accident." "You need a hospital. Phone first, please." At Wayne Memorial Hospital, Maddox pushed away the nurse trying to examine his arm and called Seymour Johnson. "The weapons," he said. "The Mark 39s. They're in the debris field somewhere. You need recovery teams out there now." Pause on the line. Then, "Stay where you are, Lieutenant." At 03:15 hours, Air Force search teams swept Wayne County with radiation detectors. They'd found the crash site, fuselage in one field, wings in another, tail section a mile away. Debris scattered across 12 square miles. The weapons bay was empty. 2 thermonuclear weapons were somewhere in the North Carolina countryside. Status unknown. Master Sergeant Ronald Clarkson led a search team moving east from the main crash site. 5 men with Geiger counters, looking for objects that could end civilization. At 03:40 hours, Clarkson's detector chirped. He swept it left and right. The chirping intensified, pointing forward. 20 yards ahead, he saw a white parachute spread across the ground. Beneath it, the unmistakable shape of a Mark 39. "I've got one," he radioed. "Weapon located. Parachute deployed. Do not approach. Technical team en route." The parachute had deployed. That meant the arming sequence had activated. That meant safety mechanisms had failed. The technical team arrived 30 minutes later. Nuclear weapons specialists, men trained in disarmament and recovery. They examined the weapon's external indicators and discovered something that would remain classified for 52 years. 5 arming mechanisms showed armed status. Captain Bruce Swanson stared at the indicators, then radioed base. "Weapon recovered. multiple safety compromises, requires immediate evaluation. What he wanted to say, Jesus Christ, we were one switch away. Later analysis by Sandia National Laboratories would determine that if the ARM/SAFE switch had been slightly different in design, or if impact had jarred it from safe to ARM, the weapon would have detonated. The switch was later described in declassified documents as a vulnerable single point of failure, but in that moment, all Swanson knew was they'd found one weapon nearly armed, and the second was still missing. Search teams expanded the grid. Radiation detectors swept field after field. Nothing. At 0600 hours, farmer L.W. Crowell found a crater in his field. 25 feet wide, perfectly circular, edges torn like something had punched straight down at incredible velocity. He called the sheriff. The sheriff called Seymour Johnson. By 0700 hours, Air Force investigators were examining the crater and calculating penetration depth. Radiation detectors showed trace readings confirming this was the impact site, but the weapon was gone, buried deep underground. They began digging. At 20 feet, they hit the water table. The hole filled faster than pumps could drain it. At 30 feet, they found casing fragments. At 50 feet, more fragments. But the main body, the plutonium core, the bulk of the device, remained deeper. After a week, the Air Force made a decision. The weapon was too deep for recovery. The excavation was becoming dangerous. The weapon had been destroyed by impact and posed no immediate radiation hazard. They filled the crater, bought the land, posted no excavation restrictions, and left the weapon where it fell. Portions of a Mark 39 thermonuclear bomb remain buried in North Carolina soil today. The official accident report was carefully worded. No nuclear detonation occurred. Radiation contamination was minimal. What it didn't say, we came within a single switch of vaporizing the East Coast. That truth remained classified until 2013. The declassified documents included a letter from a Defense Department official. It would have been bad news. In spades. Maddox spent 3 days in hospital with his arm in a cast and his mind replaying those 45 seconds. Years later, after declassification, he said, "We damn near blew up North Carolina. One switch, not multiple systems, not redundant safeguards. One switch. 3 crew members were dead. 5 survived. Those numbers were recorded and mourned, but they were nothing compared to the number that almost died. The engineers had been certain a nuclear weapon couldn't detonate accidentally. They'd designed 6 independent safety mechanisms. They'd calculated the odds at less than 1 in a million. On January 24, 1961, 5 of those 6 mechanisms failed in sequence. The 6th, a simple rotary switch later described as disturbingly vulnerable, held. Barely. A farmer in Faro woke that morning and made coffee, unaware that during the night a thermonuclear weapon had buried itself armed 3 miles from his house. A family in Goldsboro ate breakfast, unaware they'd been one switch from vaporization. Millions along the East Coast went about their day, unaware how close they'd come to lethal fallout drifting over their cities. The margin between normalcy and apocalypse had been 3 ounces of metal in the correct position, and nobody knew, not for 52 years. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blackwell stood at the edge of a crater and watched his 3rd pump fail in as many days. The motor seized with a grinding sound, choked on clay-thick water, and went silent. Around him, the excavation site looked less like a recovery operation and more like a defeat in progress, floodlights illuminating a 40-foot wide shaft filling with groundwater faster than his remaining pumps could drain it. It was February 12, 1961, 19 days since the crash. Somewhere beneath that rising water, embedded in North Carolina clay, at a depth his engineers could only guess, lay a Mark 39 thermonuclear bomb that Blackwell had been ordered to recover. He'd brought excavation equipment, industrial pumps, a team of specialists, and the absolute certainty that American engineering could extract a weapon from a hole in the ground. He was losing. This is the story of the recovery operation that failed, how a thermonuclear weapon became permanently buried in American soil because some things fall too deep to retrieve, and how the truth about that failure remained classified for 52 years. January 24th, 1961. Evening. 16 hours after the crash. The first weapon, Weapon 1 with its deployed parachute, had been recovered by sunset. A careful excavation, a crane lift, a specialized transport trailer, professional and successful. By midnight, the weapon was in a secure facility, beginning its journey toward the analysis that would reveal 5 failed safety mechanisms and a single switch away from detonation. The second impact site looked different. The crater was perfectly circular, 25 feet wide, the edges compressed inward like something had punched straight down with tremendous force, because something had. 10,000 pounds of thermonuclear weapon hitting at 700 miles per hour carries kinetic energy equivalent to a small meteor strike. The recovery team's radiation detectors chirped softly around the crater's perimeter, trace readings confirming a weapon was involved, but not providing any indication of depth. The bomb had gone straight down through topsoil and clay and disappeared. Blackwell arrived on January 25th, with orders that allowed no ambiguity: recover the weapon. The Air Force did not leave thermonuclear devices buried in American farmland. Depth was irrelevant. Difficulty was irrelevant. Extract the weapon. The excavation began with standard equipment. Backhoes bit into earth. Workers filled trucks with clay. At 10 feet they found the first fragments, twisted pieces of the weapon's casing, metal deformed by impact violence into shapes that barely resembled their original purpose. Each fragment confirmed the weapon had come this way, and confirmed how thoroughly 700 miles per hour had destroyed it. At 20 feet they hit water. It began as seepage, moisture in the clay, then trickles running down the excavation walls, then flow. The impact had fractured the water table, and now groundwater was migrating toward the crater, filling it from below faster than gravity could drain it away. Blackwell brought in pumps, industrial models capable of moving thousands of gallons per hour. They ran continuously, diesel engines roaring, discharge pipes flooding the surrounding fields. The water level dropped. The excavation continued deeper. At 30 feet, more fragments. Larger pieces this time. The weapon had definitely penetrated this deep. But the main body, the plutonium core, the uranium components, the bulk of the device, remained invisible below. The engineers made calculations based on kinetic energy and soil density. A weapon at terminal velocity could penetrate clay to depths of 150 feet or more. The impact would have temporarily liquefied the soil, allowing the weapon to punch through like a stone through water until friction and compression finally arrested its descent. Where it stopped was conjecture. How to reach it was becoming a problem with no good answers. By February 1st, the excavation had become an engineering operation that bore no resemblance to standard recovery procedures. Sheet piling had been driven into the ground to shore up the crater walls. Additional pumps had been deployed. Workers operated in shifts around the clock. Floodlights turned the rural North Carolina night into permanent artificial day, and the media had noticed. Reporters arrived from Goldsboro, then from Raleigh, then from national outlets. They photographed the massive excavation, the industrial equipment, the scale of the operation. The Air Force maintained that this was routine aircraft accident debris recovery. The reporters looked at the 40-foot crater and the pumps running 24 hours a day and printed careful stories that stayed just short of speculation about what might require this level of effort to recover. The official silence held because without confirmation, suspicion remained unprintable. At 50 feet depth, Blackwell stood in the excavation wearing boots that squelched in clay mud and looked at walls held back by steel piling, driven deep into the earth. This was no longer a crater. It was a shaft. Mining equipment would have been more appropriate than excavation tools. They'd found more weapon fragments at this depth. The radiation signature was slightly stronger. The bomb was definitely down here somewhere, but the water was winning. 3 pumps ran continuously and barely kept pace with the inflow. Every foot deeper meant fighting higher water pressure, more unstable walls, greater risk of collapse. The chief engineer presented numbers that outlined defeat in technical terms. Continuing to 70 or 80 feet would require coffer dam, a waterproof enclosure that would take weeks to construct and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Even then, success was not guaranteed. The weapon might be at 150 feet. Might be deeper, might have penetrated so far that recovery was simply impossible regardless of resources committed. Blackwell requested authorization to continue. Received it. The excavation went deeper. February 10th, 70 feet down. The shaft was now 40 feet in diameter just to maintain stable walls at this depth. The original crater had become a pit that looked like an open mine. 4 heavy pumps ran constantly. The water still rose. Workers descended on ladders into a hole lit by floodlights, where the temperature stayed cold, and the air smelled of diesel exhaust and wet clay. They dug through soil that was more liquid than solid, filled sandbags to shore up seepage points, and worked with the knowledge that the walls could collapse at any moment. They found fragments at 70 feet, small pieces. The weapon had been here, had gone deeper. Blackwell made the call he'd been avoiding, requested a meeting with the recovery operation commander, flew to Seymour Johnson and sat in an office with maps and photographs spread across the desk, showing the excavation from aerial perspective, a wound in the North Carolina landscape that had consumed 3 weeks and over $1 million with no end in sight. The question was simple. Could he recover the weapon? The honest answer was worse. He didn't know. It was deeper than any pre-accident planning had considered possible. The water table made deeper excavation a battle against hydrology that engineering might not win. The weapon was destroyed. Every fragment confirmed that impact had crushed it beyond any possibility of detonation. The radiation hazard was minimal, and continuing might cost millions more with success still uncertain. Blackwell flew back to the site and stood at the edge of the 70-foot shaft, watching pumps fight physics. Sometimes the hole is too deep, sometimes the water table is too high, sometimes you can't win. On February 18th, he transmitted his recommendation. Recovery of Weapon 2 was not feasible with available resources. Recommend termination of excavation operations. The response came 12 hours later. Cease excavation. Prepare site for permanent closure. They'd failed. A thermonuclear weapon would remain buried in American soil because retrieving it was simply impossible. The Air Force's solution was practical in a way that would have been darkly comic if the circumstances were different. They couldn't extract the weapon, so they would ensure nobody else could either. The land was purchased from farmer L.W. Crowell, a transaction whose price was never publicly disclosed. The deed included permanent easement restrictions prohibiting excavation, construction, or subsurface disturbance of any kind. The Air Force would own this circular plot of North Carolina farmland in perpetuity for the sole purpose of ensuring nobody dug here. The shaft was filled. Tons of clean soil were brought in, compacted, graded smooth. Within 2 weeks, the scar had been erased. Within a month, vegetation returned. By spring, nothing visible distinguished this plot from the surrounding farmland except a small concrete marker with no plaque, no inscription, no explanation. The weapon remains there today. GPS coordinates 35.5487 degrees north, 77.8400 degrees west. The plutonium core decaying on its 24,000-year half-life. The uranium components radioactive and inert. Somewhere between 50 and 200 feet down, embedded in clay and groundwater, unreachable. The Air Force monitors radiation levels regularly. They remain minimal, well within safe thresholds. The weapon was destroyed on impact and poses no detonation risk, but it is radioactive material that will remain hazardous for millennia, buried beneath American soil, because the alternative was worse, spending years and tens of millions of dollars excavating a crater hundreds of feet deep, with no guarantee of success. While Blackwell was fighting groundwater in North Carolina, specialists at Sandia National Laboratories were disassembling Weapon 1 and discovering how close January 24th had come to apocalypse. The analysis was documented in reports stamped top secret that would remain classified for 52 years. 5 of 6 safety mechanisms had activated during the fall. The weapon had fully armed itself except for the arm/safe switch, a component later described in declassified documents as a vulnerable single point of failure that shock or vibration could potentially move from safe to arm position. The conclusion was technical and terrifying. The Mark 39 design was inadequate for accidental release scenarios. Current safety mechanisms could not reliably prevent inadvertent nuclear yield during catastrophic aircraft failure. Translation: pure luck had prevented detonation, unacceptably pure luck, but that conclusion stayed classified. The official accident report released in limited circulation was sanitized to meaninglessness. An aircraft had crashed. Nuclear weapons were involved. One recovered intact. Recovery of the second not completed due to site conditions. No detonation occurred. Radiation levels acceptable. Every sentence true. Every implication false. The 3 dead crew members' families were told their loved ones died in an aircraft accident. Factually accurate. The families were not told the accident had been one switch away from killing millions. Also factually accurate. Wayne County residents were told an Air Force bomber had crashed near Faro. True. They were not told that a fully armed thermonuclear weapon had landed 3 miles from their homes. Also true. The American public was told nothing. Chrome Dome missions remained classified. The near detonation remained classified. The safety mechanism failures remained classified. For 52 years, the truth stayed buried almost as deep as the weapon. In 2013, the declassification came. Documents released under Freedom of Information Act requests revealed the full story. How many safety mechanisms had failed. How close the weapon had come to detonation. How a single switch had prevented catastrophe. One 1969 letter from a senior Defense Department official reviewing the incident. One simple dynamo technology low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe. Another official wrote with bureaucratic understatement, "It would have been bad news, in spades." The revelations generated international headlines. America had nearly nuked itself. A single switch prevented megaton-scale detonation over North Carolina. 5 safety mechanisms failed during accidental weapons release. By 2013, nearly everyone involved was dead. Lieutenant Maddox, retired and old, gave interviews about hanging in a tree with a broken arm, while thermonuclear weapons lay armed in darkness nearby. The few surviving crew members talked about a mission that seemed routine until it killed 3 of their friends and nearly killed millions of strangers. Wayne County residents learned they had been living for 50 years within miles of a buried nuclear weapon. Most reacted with surprising equanimity. The danger had passed decades ago. The radiation levels were safe. The weapon was destroyed and unreachable. But some asked the inevitable question: if this happened here, how many other times did it almost happen? The answer emerged through additional declassifications. At least 32 broken arrow incidents during the Cold War. Aircraft crashes with nuclear weapons aboard. Weapons accidentally dropped from bombers. Near detonations prevented by single safety mechanisms or pure chance. Goldsboro was the closest call, but it was not the only call. The concrete marker still stands in that North Carolina field. You can visit. GPS will take you there. No fence guards it anymore. The Air Force maintains the excavation easement but doesn't patrol the site. It looks like farmland because it is farmland, quiet and unremarkable except for what lies beneath. 50 to 200 feet down, the weapon waits, the plutonium decaying slowly toward stability over thousands of years, the uranium inert and radioactive, the shattered remains of a device that was 3 ounces of metal away from vaporizing Raleigh and Durham and spreading lethal fallout to Washington and New York. The Cold War ended. Chrome Dome missions were terminated in 1968 after too many accidents made the risk calculus unacceptable. Modern nuclear weapons have safety mechanisms the Mark 39 never imagined, designed specifically created after Goldsboro to ensure that catastrophic aircraft failure cannot arm a weapon. The specific danger of January 24, 1961 has passed, but the weapon is still there. It will be there when everyone who remembers that night is gone. Will be there when the concrete marker erodes. Will be there for centuries after the Cold War becomes as remote as medieval history. A permanent reminder that civilization and catastrophe can be separated by margins measured in ounces, and that some failures fall too deep to ever fix. The museum display at the National Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas contains a photograph that most visitors walk past without much attention. It shows a B-52 bomber in flight, 8 engines trailing contrails, the image perfectly routine except for the caption, Chrome Dome Patrol Aircraft 1960s, carried live thermonuclear weapons over populated areas continuously for 7 years. Next to the photograph is a small placard listing dates and locations. Palomares, Spain, 1966. 4 hydrogen bombs dropped over a fishing village. Thule, Greenland, 1968. 4 more weapons scattered across Arctic ice. And Goldsboro, North Carolina, 1961. 2 Mark 39 bombs, 1 recovered, 5 switches armed. The display is small, easy to miss. Most museum visitors are more interested in the nuclear test footage, or the replica bombs, or the radiation measurement equipment. Few stop to read about Chrome Dome or calculate what those dates mean. That for 7 years, nuclear-armed bombers flew constantly over American and Allied territory, and that the program was finally terminated not because the Cold War ended, but because the accident rate became unacceptable. This is the story of what Goldsboro should have taught us, what it actually taught us, and why the gap between those two things matters more now than ever. February 1961, Sandia National Laboratories, Albuquerque, New Mexico. The disassembled Mark 39 was laid out on examination tables in a secure facility where weapons designers could analyze exactly what had failed and why. Dr. Parker Reed had spent 15 years designing nuclear weapons safety mechanisms. He'd calculated failure probabilities, designed redundant systems, written reports, assuring military commanders that accidental detonation was statistically impossible. Now he was looking at physical evidence that 5 of 6 safety mechanisms had failed in sequence during an accidental release, and his carefully calculated probabilities were revealed as worthless. The TC/DC switch had activated, the drogue chute had deployed, the main parachute had opened, the thermal batteries had energized, the barometric sensors had armed. Each mechanism had responded exactly as designed, which was the problem. They were designed to activate during weapons release, and they couldn't distinguish between authorized release and catastrophic accident. Reed's report was classified top secret and distributed to a handful of officials with nuclear weapons oversight. The conclusions were technical, but the implications were clear. Current safety mechanisms were inadequate. The Mark 39 design was fundamentally flawed, and every weapon currently deployed on Chrome Dome missions shared similar vulnerabilities. The report triggered immediate changes. New safety mechanisms were designed with true independence, systems that required multiple intentional actions rather than sequential responses to physical conditions. Modern weapons incorporated PAL systems, permissive action links, that required cryptographic codes before arming. Designs were overhauled to ensure that catastrophic aircraft failure couldn't mimic authorized release, but those changes took years to implement, and while new weapons were being designed, the old weapons kept flying. Chrome Dome missions continued with Mark 39s and similar designs because the Cold War didn't pause for safety upgrades. The accident rate was classified but alarming. Goldsboro in 1961. A B-52 crash in Yuba City, California in 1961. Weapons aboard but no detonation risk. Another crash in Maryland in 1963. Savage Mountain in 1964. The accidents kept happening because the missions never stopped. Each incident generated classified reports. Each report recommended safety improvements. Each improvement took months or years to implement while bombers kept flying with the old designs. And then came Palomares, January 17, 1966. Palomares, Spain. A B-52 on Chrome Dome patrol collided during aerial refueling with the KC-135 tanker. Both aircraft disintegrated, 7 crew members died, and 4 B-28 thermonuclear bombs fell toward a Spanish fishing village. 3 bombs hit land. 2 scattered plutonium across farmland when their conventional explosives detonated on impact. Not nuclear detonations, but radioactive contamination that required the United States to remove 1,400 tons of contaminated Spanish soil and ship it to America for disposal. The 3rd bomb was found intact in a riverbed. The 4th bomb fell into the Mediterranean Sea and disappeared. The search operation lasted months. Submarines, deep-sea submersibles, Navy divers searching underwater terrain for a weapon that could be anywhere in thousands of square miles of ocean. The international media covered every day of the search. The accident that the Air Force had kept quiet at Goldsboro became impossible to hide at Palomares. The bomb was finally recovered from 2,850 feet of water after an 80-day search that cost millions and revealed to the world what the American public hadn't known, that nuclear-armed bombers flew constantly, and sometimes they crashed. The political fallout was worse than the radioactive contamination. Spain demanded answers. NATO allies questioned American safety protocols. Congress held hearings. The Chrome Dome program came under scrutiny that revealed an accident rate far higher than the public had imagined. And still the missions continued, because the Cold War demanded it, because Soviet bombers were flying similar missions, because mutually assured destruction required weapons always in the air, always ready, regardless of risk. Then came Thule. January 21, 1968. Thule Air Base, Greenland. A B-52 on Chrome Dome patrol suffered a cabin fire. The crew attempted an emergency landing at Thule, but the aircraft crashed 7 miles short of the runway onto sea ice. The impact ruptured the fuel tanks. The bomber exploded and burned, and 4 B-28 thermonuclear bombs fell through burning wreckage onto Arctic ice. The conventional explosives in all 4 weapons detonated from the fire. Not nuclear detonations, the safety mechanisms prevented that, but violent explosions that scattered plutonium and uranium across the ice and into the water when the ice melted. The contamination was extensive. The cleanup operation, codenamed Crested Ice, took months in Arctic conditions and recovered most, but not all of the weapons material. Traces of plutonium remain in the Thule environment today. 1 week after Thule, the Chrome Dome program was terminated, not because the Cold War ended, not because the threat diminished, but because 7 years of continuous operations had produced too many accidents, too many close calls, too much international embarrassment, and too much evidence that the risks outweighed the marginal increase in deterrent capability. The official announcement was carefully worded. Chrome Dome missions were being discontinued as part of normal strategic posture adjustments. No mention of accident rates. No acknowledgement that the program had scattered nuclear weapons and radioactive material across 3 continents. The bomber crews who had flown those missions for 7 years received no public recognition. The accidents remained classified, and the weapons kept flying, just not in continuous airborne alert patterns over populated territory. 45 years later, in 2013, the Goldsboro documents were declassified. The revelation that a single switch had prevented a megaton-scale detonation over North Carolina generated headlines worldwide, but the reaction was muted by time. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Chrome Dome was history. The danger seemed distant, a relic of a more dangerous era, but the declassification revealed something more troubling than the near miss itself. It revealed the gap between what was learned and what changed. After Goldsboro, weapons designers knew that safety mechanisms were inadequate. They redesigned the systems, But the old weapons kept flying for years because operational demands outweighed safety concerns. After Palomares, military commanders knew the accident rate was unacceptable. They maintained the missions anyway because strategic doctrine demanded airborne alerts. After Thule, the program was finally terminated, not because of safety revelations, but because the political costs became impossible to ignore. The pattern was clear. Lessons were learned only after catastrophe, and sometimes not even then. Lieutenant Adam Maddox, interviewed after the 2013 declassification, was asked what he thought about the revelations. He was 80 years old, his broken arm long healed, but the memory of hanging in that tree while nuclear weapons lay armed in darkness remained vivid. His response was simple: we were lucky, unacceptably lucky, and the fact that we relied on luck instead of proper safety design is terrifying in retrospect. The interviewer asked if he thought lessons had been learned. Maddox paused. Then, I think lessons were documented. Whether they were learned, that's a different question. Modern nuclear weapons have safety mechanisms the Mark 39 never imagined. PAL systems require cryptographic codes. Environmental sensing systems can distinguish accidents from attacks. Designs incorporate true redundancy rather than sequential activation. But the fundamental tension remains unchanged. Nuclear deterrence requires weapons ready for immediate use. Immediate readiness requires reduced safety margins. Reduced margins increase accident risk. The triangle of deterrence, readiness, and safety is inherently contradictory, and optimizing for any two vertices degrades the third. During the Cold War, deterrence and readiness were prioritized. Safety came third. Goldsboro, Palomares, and Thule were the price of that prioritization. Today, there are approximately 3,750 nuclear weapons in active U.S. military stockpiles. Another 1,750 are retired and awaiting dismantlement. Russia maintains similar numbers. China, France, Britain, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea add roughly 1,500 more weapons to the global total. None are currently flying continuous airborne patrols. That lesson at least was learned. But they are deployed in conditions of high readiness. Submarine-launched missiles can launch within minutes of orders. ICBMs and silos are maintained on alert status. Bomber bases can generate sorties within hours. The safety mechanisms are better than 1961, but they are not perfect. They cannot be perfect because perfection contradicts readiness. In 2007, a B-52 flew from Minot Air Force Base to Barksdale Air Force Base with 6 nuclear-armed cruise missiles that nobody realized were aboard. The weapons were supposed to be inert training rounds. Instead, live nuclear warheads flew across the United States for 3 hours before anyone noticed the mistake. The incident generated investigations and reprimands and safety protocol reviews, but it also revealed that 60 years after Goldsboro, nuclear weapons safety still depends partly on humans not making mistakes, and humans always eventually make mistakes. The concrete marker still stands in that North Carolina field. GPS coordinates 35.5487 degrees north, 77.8400 degrees west, marking the spot where luck prevented catastrophe. Beneath the soil, the weapon remains on its slow decay toward stability. Visitors occasionally find the site. Some leave flowers, some take photographs, most just stand there quietly, thinking about how close it was, how much depended on 3 ounces of metal in the correct position. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. The ideological struggle that justified Chrome Dome has passed into history. But the weapons remain, thousands of them, deployed and ready, their safety mechanisms better than 1961, but still ultimately dependent on systems not failing, and humans not erring, and luck holding one more time. Goldsboro taught us that nuclear weapons safety mechanisms can fail in catastrophic cascades. That lesson was learned and incorporated into better designs. Goldsboro taught us that relying on luck is unacceptable. That lesson was documented but perhaps not fully learned, because deterrence still requires readiness, and readiness still requires risk. Goldsboro taught us that the price of nuclear weapons is eternal vigilance, and the acceptance that safety margins are never as wide as we believe. That lesson is still being learned. The weapon is still there, 50 to 200 feet down, waiting in darkness. Not dangerous anymore. The radiation is minimal, the components destroyed, the detonation risk zero, but permanent. A monument to the day we nearly vaporized ourselves, and the uncomfortable truth that the margin between civilization and catastrophe has always been, and may always be, smaller than we want to believe.